The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Sir Oliver Sacks. 23. The Twins. When I first met the twins, John and Michael, in 1966 in the state hospital, they were already well known. They had been in radio and television and made the subject of detailed scientific and popular reports. They had even, I suspected, found their way into science fiction, a little fictionalized, but essentially as portrayed in the accounts that have been published. The twins, who were then 26 years old, have been in an institution since the age of 7, variously diagnosed as autistic, psychotic, or severely retarded. Most of the account concluded that, as idiotic savants go, there was nothing much to them, except for their remarkable documentary memories of the tiniest visual details of their own experience, and their use of unconscious calendrical algorithms that enabled them to say at once on what day of the week date, far in the past or future, would fall. This is a view taken by Stephen Smith in his comprehensive and imaginative book, The Great Mental Calculator, 1983. There have been, to my knowledge, no further studies of the twins since the mid-60s, the brief interest they aroused being quenched by the apparent solution of the problems they presented. But this, I believe, is a misapprehension, perhaps a natural enough one, in view of the stereotyped approach. The fixed format of questions, the concentration on one task or another, with which the original investigators approached the twins, and by which they reduced them, their psychology, their methods, their lives, almost to nothing. The reality is far stranger, far more complex, far less explicable than any of these studies suggest. That's not even to be glimpsed by aggressive formal testing or the usual 60-minute-like interviewing of the twins. Not that any of these studies or TV performances is wrong, they are quite reasonable, often informative, as far as they go, but they confine themselves to the obvious and testable surface and do not go to the depths, don't even hint or perhaps guess that there are depths below. One indeed gets no hints of any depths unless one ceases to test the twins, to regard them as subjects. One must lay aside the urge to limit and test, and get to know the twins, observe them openly, quietly, without presuppositions, but with a full and sympathetic phenomenological openness as they live and think and interact quietly, pursuing their own lives spontaneously in their singular way. Then one finds there is something exceedingly mysterious at work, bowers and depths of perhaps fundamental sort, which I haven't been able to solve in the 18 years that I have known them. They are indeed unprepossessing at the first encounter, a sort of grotesque twiddle-am and twiddly, indistinguishable mirror images, identical in face, in body movement, in personality, in mind, identical too in their stigmata of brain and tissue damage. They are undersized with disturbing disproportions in head and hands, high-arched palate, high-arched feet, monotonous squeaky voices, and a variety of peculiar tics and mannerisms, and a very high degenerative myopia, requiring glasses so thick that their eyes seem distorted, giving them the appearance of absurd little professors, beering and pointing with a misplaced, obsessed, and absurd concentration. And this impression is fortified as soon as one squeezes them, or allows them, as they are apt to do, like pantomime puppets, to start spontaneously on one of the routines. This is a picture that have been presented in published articles and on stage. They tend to be featured in the annual show in the hospital that I work in, and they're not infrequent and rather embarrassing appearances on TV. The facts under the easy circumstances are established to monotony. The twins say, "Give us a date anytime in the last or next 40,000 years." You give them a date and almost instantaneously they tell you what day of the week it would be. Another date, they cry and the performance is repeated. They will also tell you the date of Easter during the same period of 80,000 years. One may observe, though, that it's not usually mentioned in the reports that their eyes move and fix in a peculiar way as they do this, as if they were unrolling or scrutinizing an inner landscape, a mental calendar. They have the look of seeing, of intense visualization, although it had been concluded that what is involved is pure calculation. Their memory for digits is remarkable and possibly unlimited. They will repeat a number of 3 digits, of 30 digits, 300 digits with equal ease. This too has been attributed to a method, but when one comes to test their ability to calculate, the typical sort of arithmetical prodigies and mental calculators, they do astonishingly bad, as badly as their IQs of 60 might lead one to think. They can do simple addition or subtraction with any accuracy, and can even comprehend what multiplication or division means. What is this? Calculators who cannot calculate and lack even the most rudimentary powers of arithmetic. And yet they are called calendar calculators, and it has been inferred and accepted on next to no grounds that what is involved is not memory at all, but the use of an unconscious algorithm for calendar calculation. When one recollects how even Carl Friedrich Gauss, at once one of the greatest mathematicians and of calculators too, had the utmost difficulty in working out an algorithm for the date of Easter, it is scarcely credible that these twins, incapable of even the simplest arithmetical methods, could have inferred, worked out, and by using such an algorithm. A great many calculators, it is true, do have a larger repertoire of methods and algorithms they have worked out for themselves. And perhaps this predisposes W.A. Hart et.al. to conclude this was true of the twins too. Stephen Smith, taking these earlier studies at face value, comments, "Something mysterious, though commonplace, is operating here. The mysterious human ability to form unconscious algorithms on the basis of examples. If this were the beginning and end of it, they might indeed be seen as commonplace and not mysterious at all. For the computing of algorithm, which can be done well by machine, is essentially mechanical and comes into the spheres of problems but not mysterious. And yet, even in some of their performances, their tricks, there is a quality that takes one aback. They can tell one the weather and the events of any day in their lives, any day from about their fourth year on. Their way of talking, well conveyed by Robert Silverberg in his portrait of the character Melangeo, is at once childlike, detailed, without emotion. Give them a date and their eyes roll for a moment and then fixate in a flat, monotonous voice. They tell you of the weather, the bare political events they would have heard of, and the events of their own lives. This last often including the painful or poignant anguish of childhood, the contempt, the jeers, the mortification they endured, but all delivered in an even and unvarying tone without the least hint of any personal affliction or emotion. Here, clearly one is dealing with memories that seem of a documentary kind, in which there is no personal reference, no personal relation, no living center whatever. It might be said that personal involvement, emotion, has been edited out of these memories in the sort of defensive way one may observe in obsessive or schizoid types, and the twins must certainly be considered obsessive and schizoid. But it could be said equally, and indeed more plausibly, that memories of these kinds never had any personal character, for this indeed is a cardinal characteristic of eidetic memory such as this. But what needs to be stressed, and this is insufficiently remarked on by their studies, though perfectly obvious to a naive listener prepared to be amazed, is the magnitude of the twins' memory. It's apparently limitless, if childish and commonplace extent, and with this the way in which memories are retrieved. And if you ask them how they can hold so much in their minds, a 300-figure digit or the trillion events of 4 decades, they say very simply, we see it. And seeing, visualizing of extraordinary intensity, limitless range, and perfect fidelity seems to be the key to this. It seems to a native physiological capacity of their minds in a way which has some analogies to that by which A.R. Rural's famous patient described in the mind of a mnemonist. So, though perhaps the twins lack the rich synthesia and conscious organization of the mnemonist memories, but there is no doubt, in my mind at least, that there is available to the twins a broader panorama, a sort of a landscape or physiognomy of all they have ever heard or seen or thought or done, and that in the blink of an eye, externally obvious as a brief rolling and a fixation of the eye, they are able, with the mind's eye, to retrieve and see nearly anything that lies in the vast landscape. Such powers of memory are most uncommon, but they are hardly unique. We know little or nothing about why the twins or anyone else have them. Is there anything in the twins that is of deeper interest? As I have been hinting, I believe there is. It's recorded of Sir Herbert Oakley, the 19th century Edinburgh professor of music, that once taken to a form, he heard a big squeak and instantly cried, G sharp. Someone ran to the piano, and G sharp it was. My own first sight of the natural powers and natural mode of the twins came in a similar, spontaneous, and I couldn't help feeling, rather comic manner. A box of matches on their table fell and discharged its contents on the floor. 111, they both cried. 111, they both cried, simultaneously, and then, in a murder, Jean said, 37. Michael repeated this. Jean said it in a third time and stopped. I counted the matches, it took me some time, and there were 1100. How could you count the matches so quickly? I asked. We didn't count, they said. We saw 111. Similar tales are told by Scotch Days, the number prodigy, who would instantly call out 183 or 79. If a pile of bees was poured out and indicate as best he could, he was also a dullard, that he did not count the bees, but just saw their number as a whole in a flash. And why do you murmur 37 and repeat it 3 times? I asked the twin. They said it in a unison. 37, 37, 37, 111. And this, if possible, I found even more puzzling. That they should see 111ness in a flash was extraordinary, but perhaps no more extraordinary than Oakley's G sharp, a sort of absolute pitch, so to speak, of 4 numbers. But they had then gone on to factor the number 111 without having any method, without even knowing in the ordinary way what factors meant. Had I not already observed that they were incapable of the simplest calculations, and did not understand, or seem to understand, what multiplication or division was. Yet now, simultaneously, they had divided a compound number into 3 equal parts. How did you work that out? I said, rather hotly. They indicated as best they could in poor insufficient terms, but perhaps there are no words to consider to such thing, correspond to such things, that they did not work it out or just saw it in a flash. John made a gesture with two outstretched fingers and his thumb, which seemed to suggest that they had spontaneously trisected the number, or that it came apart of its own accord into these three equal parts by sort of spontaneous numerical fission. They seemed surprised at my surprise, and as if were somehow blind, and John's gesture conveyed an extraordinary sense of immediate felt reality. Is it possible, I said to myself, that they can somehow see the properties, not in a conceptual abstract way, but as qualities, felt, sensuous in some immediate concrete way? And not simply isolated qualities like 111ness, but qualities of relationship, perhaps in somewhat the same way as Sir Herbert Oakley might have said a third or a fifth. I had already come to feel, through their seeing events and dates, that they could hold in their minds, did hold, an immense mnemonic tapestry, a vast or possibly infinite landscape in which everything could be seen, scissor isolated or in relation. It was isolation rather than a sense of relation that was chiefly exhibited when they unfurled the implacable, hazardous documentary. But might not such prodigies power of visualization, powers essentially concrete and quite distinct from conceptualization, might not such powers give them the potential of seeing relations, formal relations, relations of form, arbitrary or significant? If they could see the 111ness at a glance, if they could see an entire constellation of numbers, might they not also see at a glance, see, recognize, relate, and compare, in an entirely sensual and non-intellectual way, enormously complex formation and constellation of numbers? A ridiculous, even disabling power, I thought of Berg's fins. We, at one glance, can perceive three glasses on a table, fionce all the leaves and tendrils and fruit that make up a grapevine, a circle drawn on a blackboard, a right angle, a lozenge. All these are forms we can fully and intuitively grasp. Irene could do the same with the stormy mane of a pony, with a herd of cattle on a hill. I don't know how many stars she could see in the sky. Could the twins, who seemed to have a peculiar passion and grasp of numbers, could these twins who had seen the 111ness at a glance perhaps see in their minds a numerical vine, with all the numbers, leaves, number tendrils, number fruit, that made it up? A strange, perhaps absurd, almost impossible thought, but what they had already shown me was so strange as to be almost beyond comprehension. And it was, for all I knew, the merest hint of what they might do. I thought about the matter, but it hardly bore thinking about, and then I forgot it until a second spontaneous scene, a magical scene which I blurred into completely by chance. The second time, they were seated in a corner together, with a mysterious secret smile on their faces, a smile I had never seen before, enjoying the strange pleasure and peace they now seemed to have. I crept up quietly, so as not to disturb them. They seemed to be locked in a singular, purely numerical converse. Jean would say a number, a six-figure number. Michael would catch the number, nod, smile, and seem to savor it. Then he, in turn, would say another six-figure number, and now it was John who received and appreciated it richly. They looked at first like two conjurers wine testing, sharing rare tastes, rare appreciations. I sat still, unseen by them, mesmerized, bewildered. What were they doing? What on earth was going on? I could make nothing of it. It was perhaps a sort of game, but it had a gravity and intensity, a sort of serene and meditative and almost holy intensity, which I had never seen in any ordinary game before, and which I certainly had never seen before in usually agitated and distracted twins. I contented myself with noting down the numbers they uttered, the numbers that manifestly gave them such delight, and which they contemplated, savored, shared in communion. Had the numbers any meaning? I wondered in the way. Had they any real or universal sense, or, if any at all, a merely whimsical or private sense like the secret and silly languages brothers and sisters sometimes work out for themselves? And as I drove home, I thought of Laura's twins, Luatia and Nura, brain damaged, speech damaged identical twins, and how they would play and prattle with each other in a primitive, Babel-like language of their own. John and Michael were not even using words or half-words, simply throwing numbers at each other. Were these Borgosian or Fibonaccian numbers? Were mere numerical vines, or bony mains, or constellations, private number forms, sort of a number argot known to the twins alone. As soon as I got home, I pulled out tables of powers, factors, logarithms, and primes, momentous and relics of an odd, isolated period in my own childhood, and I too was a something of a number broader, a number seer, and had peculiar passion for numbers. I already had the hunch, and now I confirmed it. All the numbers, the six-figure numbers, which the twins had exchanged, were primes, numbers that could be evenly divided by no other whole number than itself or one. Had they somehow seen or possessed such a book as mine? Or were they, in some unimaginable way, themselves seeing primes in somewhat the same way as they had seen the 111s or triple 37s? Certainly they could not be calculating them, they could calculate nothing. I returned to the ward the next day, carrying the precious book of primes with me. I again found them closest in their numerical communion, but this time, without saying anything, I quietly joined them. They were taken aback at first, but when I made no interruption, they resumed their game of six-figure primes. After a few minutes, I decided to join in and venture a number, an 8-figure prime. They both turned towards me. They suddenly became still, with a look of intense concentration and perhaps wonder on their face. There was a long pause, the longest I have ever known them to make. It must have lasted a half a minute or more. And then suddenly, simultaneously, they both broke into smiles. They had, after some unimaginable internal process of testing, suddenly seen my own 8-digit number as a prime. And this was manifestly a great joy, a double joy to them. First, because I had introduced a delightful new plaything, a prime of an order they had never previously encountered, and secondly, because it was evident that I had seen what they were doing, that I liked it, that I admired it, and that I could join in myself. They drew apart slightly, making room for me, a new number playmate, a third in their world. Then John, who always took the lead, thought for a very long time. It must have been at least 5 minutes, though I dared not move and scarcely breathe, and brought out a 9-figure number, and after a similar time his twin, Michael, responded with a similar one. And then I, in my turn, after a surreptitious look in my book, added my own rather dishonest contribution, a 10-figured prime I found in my book. There was again, and for even longer, a wondering, still silence, and then John, after a British internal contemplation,
brought out a 12-figure number. I had no way of checking this and could not respond, because my own book, which as far as I knew, was unique of its kind, did not give beyond 10-figure rhymes, but Michael was up to it. Though it took him 5 minutes and an hour later that the twins were swapping 20-figure rhymes, at least I assumed this was so I had no way for checking it. Nor was there an easy way in 1966, unless one had the use of a sophisticated computer, and even then it would have been difficult whether one uses arithmetic or any other algorithm. There is no simple method of calculating rhymes. There is no simple method for rhymes of this order, and yet the twins were doing it. Again, I thought of Das, whom I had read years before in F.W.H. Meyer's enchanting book, Human Personality, 1903. We know that Das, perhaps the most successful of such prodigies, was singularly devoid of mathematical grasp.
Yet he, in 12 years, made tables of factors and prime numbers for the sevenths and nearly the whole of 8 million, a task which few men could have accomplished without mechanical aid in an ordinary lifetime. He may thus be ranked, Myers concluded, as the only man who has ever done valuable service to mathematics without being able to cross the Ass's Bridge. What is not made clear by Myers, and perhaps was not clear, is whether Dace had any method for the tables he made up, or whether, as hinted in his simple number-seeing experiments, he somehow saw these great rhymes as apparently the twins did. As I observed them quietly, this was easy to do because I had an office on the ward where the twins were half. I observed them in countless other sorts of number games or number communions, the nature of which I could not ascertain or even guess at. But it seems likely or certain that they were dealing with rare properties or qualities, for the arbitrary, such as a random numbers, gives them no pleasure or scarcely any at all. It's clear that they must have sense in their numbers, in the same way, perhaps, as a musician must have harmony. Indeed, I found myself comparing them to musicians, or to Martin, chapter 22, also retarded, who found in the serene and magnificent architectonics of Bach sensible manifestations of the ultimate harmony and order of the world, wholly inaccessible to him conceptually because of his intellectual limitations. Whoever is harmonically composed, writes Sir Thomas Browne, delights in harmony, and a profound contemplation of the first composer. There is something in it of divinity more than the ear discovers. It is an hieroglyphical and short lesson of the whole world, a sensible fit of the harmony which intellectually sounds in the ears of God. The soul is harmonical and hath its nearest sympathy unto music. Richard Wilhelm in The Thread of Life 1984 makes an absolute distinction between calculation and what he calls iconic mental states, and he anticipates a possible objection to this distinction. Someone might dispute the fact that all calculations are non-iconic on grounds that, when he calculates, sometimes he does so by visualizing the calculation on a page. But this is not a counterexample, for what is presented in such cases is not the calculation itself, but a representation of it.
It is numbers that are calculated, but what is visualized are numerals, which represent numbers. Leibniz, on the other hand, makes a tantalizing analogy between numbers and music. The pleasure we obtain from music comes from counting. But counting unconsciously, music is nothing but unconscious arithmetic. What, so far as we can ascertain, is the situation of the twins and perhaps others. Ernest Stoch, the composer, his grandson, Lawrence Verschler, tells me, could readily hold in his mind after a single hearing a very long string of numbers, but he did this by converting the string of numbers to a tone, a melody he himself shaped, corresponding to the numbers. Jedediah Paxton, one of the most ponderous but tenacious calculators of all time, and a man who has a veritable, even pathological, passion for calculation and counting. He would become, in his own words, drunk with reckoning, would convert music and drama to numbers. During the dance, a contemporary account of him recorded in 1754, he fixed his attention upon the number of steps. He declared of a fine piece of music that the innumerable sounds produced by the music had perplexed him beyond measure, and he attended even to Mr. Garrick's only to count the words that he uttered, in which he said he perfectly succeeded. Here is a pretty, if extreme, pair of examples. The musician who turns numbers into music, and the counter who turns music into numbers. One could scarcely have, one feels, more opposite sorts of minds, or at least more opposite modes of minds. Something comparable to Buxton mode, which perhaps appears the more unnatural of the two, was shown by my patient Miriam H. in Awakenings when she had arithmomanic attacks. I believe the twins, who have an extraordinary feeling for numbers, without being able to calculate at all, or allied not to Buxton, but to Tuch in this matter. Except, and this was ordinary people find so difficult to imagine, except that they don't convert numbers into music, but actually feel them in themselves as forms, as tones like the multitudinous form that compose nature itself. They are not calculators, and their numerically is iconic. They summed up, they dwell among strange scenes of numbers. They wander freely in great landscapes of numbers. They create dramatically whole world made of numbers. They have, I believe, most singular imagination, and not the least of its singularities is that it can imagine only numbers. They don't seem to operate with numbers, non-iconically, like a calculator. They see them directly as a vast natural scene. And if one asks, are there analogues, at least, to such an iconicity, one would find this, I think, in certain scientific minds. Dmitri Mendeleev, for example, carried around with him, written on cards, the numerical properties of elements until they became utterly familiar to him. So familiar that he no longer thought of them as aggregates of properties, but, so he tells us, as familiar faces. He now saw the elements iconically, physiognomically, as faces. Faces that relate like members of a family and that made up in toto periodically arranged the whole formal face of the universe. Such a scientific mind is essentially iconic and sees all nature as faces and scenes, perhaps as music as well. This vision, this inner vision, sufficed from the phenomenal, sufficed with the phenomenal, nonetheless had an integral relation with the physical and returning it from the psychical to the physical constitutes the secondary.
or external work of such science. The philosopher seeks to hear within himself the echoes of the world symphony, writes Nietzsche, and to reproject them in the form of concepts. The twins, though morons, hear the world symphony and conjecture, but hears it entirely in the form of numbers. The twins, I believe, have not just a strange faculty, but a sensibility, a harmonic sensibility, perhaps allied to that of music. One might speak of it, very naturally, as a bisagram sensibility. And what is odd is not its existence, but that it's apparently so rare. One's soul is harmonical, and whatever one's IQ, and perhaps the need to find or feel some ultimate harmony or order is a universal of the mind. Whatever its powers and whatever form it takes, mathematics has always been called the queen of sciences, and mathematicians have always felt numbers as the great mystery, and the world as organized mysteriously by the power of numbers. This is beautifully expressed in the prologue to Bertrand Russell's autobiography. With equal passion I have sought knowledge. I have wished to understand the hearts of men. I have wished to know why the stars shine. And I have tried to apprehend the Pythagorean power by which numbers hold sway above the flux. It's strange to compare these moron twins to an intellect, a spirit like that of Bertrand Russell, and yet it is not, I think, so far-fetched. The twins live exclusively in a thought world of numbers. They have no interest in the stars shining or the hearts of men, and yet numbers for them, I believe, are not just numbers, but significance, signifiers whose significance is the world. They don't approach numbers lightly, as some calculators do. They are not interested in, have no capacity for, cannot comprehend calculations. They are rather a serene contemplator of number, and approach numbers with sense of reverence and awe. Numbers for them are holy, fraught with significance. This is their way, as music is Martin's way of apprehending the first composer. But numbers are not just awesome for them, they are friends too, perhaps the only friends they have known in their isolated autistic lives. This is rather common sentiment among people who have a talent for numbers, and Stephen Smith, while seeing method as all important, gives many delightful examples of it. George Barker Bitter, who wrote of his early number childhood, I became perfectly familiar with numbers up to 100. They became, as it were, my friends, and I know all their relations and acquaintances. Or the contrary, Shyam Marth from India. When I say that numbers are my friends, I mean that I have sometime in the past dealt with a particular number in a variety of ways, and on my occasion have found new and fascinating qualities hidden in it. So, if in a calculation I come across a known number, I immediately look to him as a friend. Hermann von Helmholtz, speaking of musical perception, says that though compound tones can be analyzed and broken down into their components, they are normally heard as qualities, unique qualities of tone, indivisible wholes. He speaks here of a synthetic perception which transcends analysis and is the analyzable essence of all musical scene. He compares such tones to faces and speculates that we may recognize them in somewhat the same personal way. In brief, he half suggests that musical tones, and certainly tones, are in fact faces for the ear, and are recognized, felt immediately as persons or personalities. A recognition involving warmth, emotion, personal relation. So it seems to be with those who love numbers,
These two become recognizable as such in a single intuitive personal "I know you." Particularly fascinating and fundamental problems are raised by the perception and recognition of faces. For there is much avoidance that we recognize faces, at least familiar faces, directly, and not by any process of abysmal analysis or aggregation. This, as we have seen, is most dramatically shown in prosopagnosia, in which, as a sequence of lesions in the right occipital cortex, patients become unable to recognize faces as such and have to employ an elaborate, absurd, and indirect route involving a bit-by-bit analysis of meaningless and separate features. The mathematician Wim Klein, he put this well: numbers are friends for me. More or less, it doesn't mean the same for you, does it? 3,844. For you, it's just a 3 and an 8 and a 4 and a 4. But I say, hey, 62 squared. I believe that twins, seemingly so isolated, live in a world full of friends, that they have millions, billions of numbers to which they say hi, and which I'm sure say hi back, but none of the numbers is arbitrary like 62 squared, nor, and this is a mystery, is it arrived at by any of the usual methods or any method so far as I can make out. The twins seem to employ direct cognition like angels. They see directly a universe and heaven of numbers, and this, however singular, however bizarre, but what right have we call it pathological, provides a singular self-sufficiency and serenity to their lives, and one which it might be tragic to interfere with or break. This serenity was in fact interrupted and broken up 10 years later, when it was felt that the twins should be separated for their own good, to prevent their unhealthy communication together, and in order that they could come out and face the world in an appropriate, socially acceptable way, as the medical and sociological jargon had it. They were separated then in 1977 with results that might be considered as either gratifying or dire. Both have been moved now into halfway houses and do menial jobs, or for pocket money under close supervision. They are able to take buses, if carefully directed and given a token, and to keep themselves moderately presentable and clean, though their moronic and psychotic character is still recognizable at a glance. This is the positive side, but there is a negative side too, not mentioned in their charts, because it was never recognized in the first place. Deprived of their numerical communion with each other and of time and opportunity for any contemplation or communion at all, they are always being hurried and jostled from one job to another. They seem to have lost their strange numerical power, and with this, the chief joy and sense of their lives. But this is considered a small price to pay, no doubt, for their having become quasi-independent and socially acceptable. One is reminded somewhat of the treatment meted out to Nadia, an autistic child with a phenomenal gift for drawing. Nadia, too, was subjected to therapeutic regime to find ways in which her potentials in other directions could be maximized. The net effect was that she started talking and stopped drawing. Nigel Dennis comments, "We are left with a genius who has had her genius removed, leaving nothing behind but a general defectiveness. What are we supposed to think about such curious cure?" It should be added, this is a point dwelt on by F.W.H. Myers, whose consideration of numbers prodigies opened his chapter to ingenious, that the faculty is strange and may disappear spontaneously, though it is, as often, lifelong. In the case of the twins, of course, it wasn't just a faculty, but the personal and emotional center of their lives. And now they are separated, now it's gone, there is no longer any sense or center to their lives. On the other hand, should this discussion be thought too singular or reserved? perverse. It is important to note that in the case of the twins studied by Laura, their separation was essential for their own development, unlocked them from a meaningless and sterile bubble and bent, and permitted them to develop as healthy and creative people. Postscript. When he was shown the script of this paper, Israel Rosenfield pointed out that there are other arithmetics higher and simpler than the conventional arithmetic of operations, and wondered whether the twins' singular powers and limitations might not reflect their use of such modular arithmetic. In a note to me, he has speculated that modular algorithm of the sort described by Ian Stewart in Concepts of Modern Mathematics 1975 may explain the twins' calendrical abilities. Their ability to determine the days of the week within an 80,000-year period suggests a rather simple algorithm. One divides the total number of days between now and then by 7. If there is no remainder, then the date falls on the same days as now. If the remainder is 1, then the date is 1 day later, and so on. Notice the modular arithmetic is cyclic. It consists of repetitive patterns. Perhaps the twins were visualizing these patterns either in the form of easily constructed charts or some kind of landscape like the spiral of integers shown on page 13 of Stewart's book. This leaves unanswered why the twins communicate in primes, but calendar arithmetic requires the prime of 7. And if one is thinking of modular arithmetics in general, modular division will produce neat cyclic patterns only if one uses prime numbers. Since the prime number 7 helps the twin to retrieve dates, and consequently the events of particular days in their lives, other primes they may have found produce similar patterns, though they are so important for their actual recollection. When they say about the matchstick 111, 37 3 times, note they are taking the primes 37 and multiplying by 3. In fact, only the prime patterns could be visualized. The different patterns produced by different prime numbers, for example, multiplication tables, may be the pieces of the visual information that are communicating to each other when they repeat a given prime number. In short, modular arithmetic may help them to retrieve their past, and consequently the patterns created in using these calculations, which only occur with primes, may take on particular significance for the twins. By the use of such modular arithmetics, Ian Stewart points out, one may rapidly arrive at a unique solution in situations that defeat any ordinary arithmetic. In particular, homing in by the so-called buttonhole principle. On extremely large and, by conventional methods, incomputable primes. Such methods, such visualization, are regarded as algorithms. They are algorithms of a very peculiar sort, organized not algebraically but spatially as trees, spirals, architectures, thought spaces, configurations in a normal yet quasi-sensory mental space. I have been excited by Israel Rosenfield comments and Ian Stewart's exposition of higher and especially modern modular arithmetics, for these seem to promise, if not a solution, at least a powerful elimination of otherwise inexplicable powers like those of the twins. Such higher or deeper arithmetics were conceived in principle by Gauss in Disquisition Arithmetica in 1801, but they have only turned to practical realities in recent years. One has to wonder whether there may not be conventional arithmetic, that is, an arithmetic of operations often irritating to teacher and student, unnatural and hard to learn, and also a deep arithmetics of the kind described by Gauss, which may be truly innate to the brain, as innate as Chomsky's deep syntax and generation grammars. Such an arithmetic in mind, like the twins, could be dynamic and almost alive. Globular clusters and nebula of numbers whirling and evolving in an ever-expanding mental sky. As already mentioned, after publication of the twin, I received a great deal of communication, both personal and scientific. Some dealt with the specific themes of seeing or apprehending numbers. Some with a sense or significance which might attach to this phenomena, some with the general character of autistic dispositions and sensibilities, and who they might be fostered or inhibited, and some with the question of identical twins. Especially interesting were the letters from parents of such children, the rarest and most remarkable from parents who had themselves been forced into reflection and research, and who had succeeded in combining the deepest feeling and involving with a profound objectivity. In this category were the Barks' highly gifted parents of a highly gifted but autistic child. The Barks' child, Ella, was a talented drawer and was also highly gifted with numbers, especially in her earlier years. She was fascinated by the order of numbers, especially primes. This peculiar feel for primes is evidently not uncommon. C.C. Bark wrote to me of another autistic child she knew who covered sheets of paper with numbers written down compulsively. All were primes, she noted, and added, "They are windows into another world." Later she mentioned a recent experience with a young autistic man who was also fascinated by factors and primes, and also he instantly perceived these as special. Indeed, the word special might be used to elicit a reaction. Anything special, Joe, about that number, 4,875? Joe, it's just divisible by 13 and 25. Of another, 7,241. It's divisible by 13 and 557. And of 8,741, it's a prime number. Bark comments, "No one in his family reinforced his primes. They are a solitary pleasure." It's not clear in these cases how the answers are arrived at almost instantaneously, whether they are worked out, known, remembered, or somehow just seen. What is clear is a peculiar sense of pleasure and significance attaching to primes. Some of this seems to go with a sense of formal beauty and symmetry, but some with a peculiar association, meaning, or potency. This was often called magical in Ella's case. Numbers, especially primes, called up special thoughts, images, feelings, relationships, some almost too special or magic to be mentioned. This is well described in David Baker's Barks paper. Kurt Gödel, in a wholly general way, he has discussed some numbers, how numbers, especially primes, can serve as markers for ideas, people, places, whatever, and such a Gaudian markings would pave the way for an arithmetization or numeralization of the world. If this does occur, it's possible that the twins and others like them don't merely live in a world of numbers, but in the world as numbers, their numbers mediation or play being a sort of existential meditation, and if one can understand it or find the key, as David Barker sometimes does, a strange and precise communication too.